The phone rang like it had a grudge. Frank Lucas had been half awake, half ready, lying still the way you learn to lie still when the city can change your life before breakfast. The room was dark. Eva's breathing was slow beside him. Outside, Harlem was quiet in that strange, fragile way it gets right before morning decides what kind of day it's going to be. Frank picked up on the second ring. No greeting, no small talk, just a voice on the other end that sounded like it was swallowing glass. Frank. It happened. Frank sat up. What happened? A pause. A breath. Bumpy's gone. 2 words. Heavy. Final. Frank's hand tightened around the receiver, like he could squeeze time back into place if he held on hard enough. For a moment, he didn't speak, because speaking would make it real. And in Frank's world, the moment something became real, the vultures arrived. Say it again, Frank said, not because he didn't hear, but because he needed the universe to confirm it. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, died tonight. Hart, Wells Restaurant. Wells Restaurant. Frank's eyes locked on the ceiling like it had suddenly become a witness. He knew that place. Everybody knew it. A Harlem room where deals got spoken softly and disrespect got buried quietly. Bumpy Johnson was more than a name. He was gravity. The kind of man who could keep Harlem from tearing itself into pieces simply by existing. A man who had survived prisons, enemies, indictments, and the constant itch of betrayal that followed power like a shadow. And now, on July 7th, 1968, he was gone. Frank lowered the phone slowly, like setting down something sacred. Eva stirred. Frank? He didn't answer right away, because the next part wasn't grief. The next part was math. When a king dies, the streets don't mourn first. They measure, they calculate, they move pieces. Frank turned his head and stared at the faint light cutting through the blinds. He could already feel it, the city reshuffling like a deck of cards. The Italians would want their cut. The ambitious crews would smell blood. The men who had always waited for Bumpy to blink would start walking different. Eva sat up now, reading his face. What is it? Frank swallowed once. Bumpy. Her hand flew to her mouth. No. Yeah. Silence stretched. In that silence, Frank remembered Bumpy's voice, not loud, not dramatic, controlled. The voice of a man who knew people watched everything. Frank, Bumpy had once told him, you can't look like you're reaching. You reach, and they'll grab your wrists and pull your arms off. Frank remembered the lessons, remembered the way Bumpy made a room settle without raising his voice, remembered the way men who claimed they feared nothing still watched Bumpy's hands, and now those hands were still. Eva's eyes were wet. What are you going to do? Frank stood up. The room suddenly felt too small, like the walls were closing in around a future that didn't have rules anymore. I'm going to the funeral, Frank said. That's not a plan. It is, he said, voice low, because the funeral is where the next king gets chosen. Eva stared at him. Frank! He opened a drawer, took out a small notebook with numbers only he understood. He didn't flip through it like a man looking for comfort. He flipped through it like a man looking for a weapon. Under his breath, he said words that weren't a prayer. They're going to test whoever walks in there, Eva whispered. And you? Frank looked at her, and for the first time his grief showed, quick as a flicker. I'm going to make sure they never see me as small again. He snapped the notebook shut. Then he said the line that would haunt Harlem for months. Bumpy left a hole. Somebody's going to fill it, and I'm not letting strangers wear his crown. Outside, the city was still quiet, but inside Frank Lucas, Harlem had already started to roar. By sunrise, Harlem didn't feel like Harlem anymore. It felt like a church right before the sermon starts. Too many eyes, too much stillness, too much patience hiding something ugly underneath. Frank moved through it like he belonged to the quiet, even though his mind was loud. He went downtown first, not because he wanted to, but because certain moves had to happen away from familiar corners. In Harlem, every man had a cousin who watched. Every block had a pair of eyes that didn't blink. Frank wore plain clothes, no flash, no statement. He kept his head level and his steps measured, but in his chest the truth thumped hard. Bumpy was dead, and the city would soon decide whether Frank was a footnote or a problem. When he reached the bank, he didn't look like a gangster. He looked like a man with a purpose so strong it made him calm. The teller asked polite questions. Frank gave polite answers. He didn't smile. He didn't rush. And when the teller finally slid the stacks across, paper that could buy homes, cars, loyalty, Frank felt something strange. Not excitement, gravity. It wasn't just cash, it was proof. It was a language every criminal understood better than English. $100,000. In 1968, that was a number you didn't casually carry around. It wasn't money. It was a dare. Eva waited outside, her eyes scanning the street the way wives of men like Frank learned to scan. When Frank got in, she saw the case, and her face tightened. "Frank," she said carefully, "tell me you didn't—" He didn't answer immediately. He stared forward through the windshield, like the city owed him an explanation. "I did," he said. "How much?" He turned just enough for her to see the steadiness in his eyes. 100. 100,000? Her voice cracked. "You can't. Frank, you can't walk around with that." He nodded once, slow. "That's why I have to." Eva gripped the steering wheel, knuckles whitening. "You're talking like this is a performance." "It is," Frank said, "but not for them." He tapped the case lightly. "This is for the future." Eva's eyes sharpened. "What future?" Frank's voice dropped, almost gentle. "The one where nobody ever calls me just anything again." They drove back toward Harlem, and the streets looked the same, but the air didn't. News traveled fast in neighborhoods built on whispers. Men stood a little straighter. Conversations ended when cars passed. Somebody had died, and the city was deciding who would inherit the silence he left behind. At the church, the crowd wasn't just large, it was layered. Old women in hats who had prayed for Bumpy and cursed him in the same breath. Young men in sharp suits trying to look older than they were. Politicians with careful faces. Hustlers with careful hands. And then the other layer. The men who didn't come to mourn. They came to measure. Frank felt them before he saw them. The quiet clusters, the expensive shoes, the eyes that didn't soften even in a house of God. Those men didn't believe in funerals. They believed in transitions. Frank entered without rushing, the case in his hand. Heads turned. Some recognized him, some didn't. And the ones who did recognize him, those were the dangerous ones, because recognition came with assumptions. "Bumpy's man," someone murmured. "Driver," someone else said. Frank heard it. Let it land. Let it spread. He walked forward, past pews packed tight, past faces tightening into curiosity, past the easy grief and into the hard attention. He stopped near the front. He didn't speak. He didn't look around like he needed permission. He set the case down. The latch clicked open, crisp and clean in the hush. And when the first stack of bills showed itself, the room changed temperature. Not because people loved money, but because money told the truth that words could lie about. Eva, watching from behind, whispered, "Frank, please." Frank didn't look back. Because this wasn't about being loud. This was about being undeniable. He reached into the case and lifted the cash as if it weighed nothing, even though he felt every ounce of risk in it. He didn't toss it. He didn't wave it. He held it with control, the way Bumpy held a room. And in that moment, every gangster in Harlem understood the message even before Frank said a single word. A small man does not walk into a king's funeral carrying $100,000 unless he is either insane or ready to become something the city can't ignore. Frank didn't put on a speech like a politician. He let silence do the work first. He stood there at the front, with the open case at his feet, and the money visible enough to make every ambitious man in the room feel his throat tighten. Some people stared like it was blasphemy. Some stared like it was a miracle. But the men who mattered stared like it was a challenge. Frank looked at Bumpy's family first. Not the hustlers. Not the sharks. The family. Because in Harlem, if you wanted to claim respect, you started by honoring the people who carried the grief. Frank's voice came out steady, not dramatic. "This is for the house," he said. "For the people he leaves behind. For the things he cared about." He turned slightly, addressing the room without turning it into theater. "Bumpy lived bigger than all of us," Frank continued. "And some of you here loved him. Some of you feared him. Some of you wanted what he had." His eyes moved across the front rows where the hard faces sat. "And now he's gone." The words hung there, heavier because nobody could deny them. Frank didn't claim Bumpy's empire like it was a trophy. That would be too neat, too Hollywood. Real life didn't hand out crowns in church. Instead, Frank did something more dangerous. He framed the future as responsibility. "When a man like that dies," Frank said, "the streets don't just lose a leader, they lose balance." He closed the case slowly, but he didn't lift it yet. That mattered. Leaving it on the floor, said, "I'm not hiding it. I'm not afraid of it being seen." Then he looked toward the clusters of power. In that look, he didn't threaten anyone outright. He didn't have to. Harlem understood tone. "I'm not here to argue," Frank said. "I'm here to make one thing clear." He paused, and the room leaned in without realizing it. "Harlem isn't a carcass," he said. "It isn't something you carve up because you think nobody's watching. Harlem belongs to Harlem." Now the men in the front row shifted. Tiny movements. But Frank saw them. A jaw tightening, a shoulder squaring, a glance traded between two men who had never needed permission in their lives. That's what Frank wanted. Not anger. Attention. Because attention was the first step to negotiation. And negotiation was better than bullets when you were still building. Eva's stomach was a knot behind him. She could feel how thin the line was between bold and dead. Frank reached down and lifted the case. The money inside didn't just represent generosity. It represented commitment. He walked toward Bumpy's widow, careful, respectful, and set the case with her people, not in her hands like he was performing charity, but in their care like it was an obligation. Then he leaned in and said something only she could hear, something quiet, something human. "Whatever happens next," Frank murmured, "they won't leave you unprotected." When he straightened, a murmur rolled through the church, because now the room understood the real play. Frank wasn't saying, "I'm rich." Frank was saying, "I'm loyal." And loyalty was a currency even gangsters respected, because loyalty was rare and expensive. Frank turned to leave, and that's when it happened. The moment that made the hair rise on the back of his neck. A man stepped into his path, close enough that nobody else would notice, but positioned perfectly to block him. The man didn't look Harlem. He looked downtown. Clean suit. Cold eyes. The kind of face that had seen enough violence to stop reacting to it. He didn't introduce himself loudly. He didn't make a scene. He leaned in just slightly and spoke low. "Frank Lucas," he said, like tasting the name. Frank didn't flinch. "Yeah." The man smiled without warmth. "You brought a lot of cash into a room full of hungry men," he said. "That's either brave or stupid." Frank stared straight at him. "Depends who's watching." The man's smile widened a fraction. "Oh, we're watching." Frank felt Eva behind him, felt her fear like a hand on his shoulder. The man shifted closer. "Tonight," he said. 8 o'clock. East Harlem, a restaurant where the lights stay low and the questions stay quiet. Frank held the man's gaze. "And if I don't come?" The man's voice dropped even further. "Then you just told everybody in this church you're not who you're pretending to be." He stepped aside as if nothing happened. Frank walked past him, heart steady, mind racing. Outside, the air hit his face cold. Eva rushed to him. "Frank, who was that?" Frank didn't answer right away, because he understood what just happened. The funeral wasn't the end of Bumpy Johnson's story. It was the starting gun for the war that came after, and someone had just invited Frank to the first meeting. The restaurant didn't have a sign. It didn't need one. The kind of place where power met didn't advertise. It survived on whispers and appointments that couldn't be written down. Frank arrived a few minutes early on purpose. Early meant you weren't scared. Late meant you were careless. On time meant you were obedient. Frank didn't like obedience. Inside, the room was dim and quiet. The tables were too spaced out for comfort. Spacing meant privacy, and privacy meant plans. A waiter guided him without asking his name. That alone told Frank everything. Someone had arranged the room. A single table waited at the back. 3 men sat there. Not loud men, not flashy men. The worst kind, men who didn't need to prove anything. Frank's instincts told him to scan for exits, for angles, for hands under jackets. But he didn't move like prey. He walked like he belonged. He pulled out the chair and sat. The man from the church sat in the middle, the natural center, without declaring himself the boss. He poured wine into a glass he didn't drink from yet. "You made an impression today," the man said. Frank's face stayed calm. "That was the point." One of the other men, older, heavier, tilted his head. "You knew exactly what you were doing, or you didn't." Frank didn't smile. "If I didn't, I'd be dead already." The third man, quiet, sharp, watched Frank, like he was counting his breaths. The middleman finally spoke again. "Bumpy Johnson kept Harlem. Stable," he said carefully. "That stability came from agreements." Frank listened. He didn't interrupt. Interrupting was for men who didn't understand the game. The middleman continued. "Now he's gone, and we're hearing you want to rewrite agreements." Frank's eyes didn't move. "I'm not rewriting anything that's fair." The older man gave a short laugh. "Fair," he repeated, like it was a foreign word. Frank leaned forward slightly. Not aggressive, intentional. "Bumpy was respected," Frank said. "Not just feared. There's a difference. If you want Harlem to stay stable, you don't treat it like a tax farm." The quiet man finally spoke. "And you think you're the one who decides that?" Frank didn't answer with pride. He answered with reality. "I think Harlem decides," he said. "And right now, Harlem is watching who steps into Bumpy's shadow." The middleman took a slow breath. "Let's talk plain. You walked into a funeral with $100,000. Frank's voice stayed even. "I walked in with responsibility." The older man shook his head. "Or you walked in with a myth." Frank knew what he meant. The street had already started turning the moment into legend. In Harlem, stories traveled faster than facts, and facts often got rewritten by whoever needed power. Frank didn't correct the myth. He didn't confirm it either. He just said, "I walked in with something that made people pay attention." The quiet man's eyes narrowed. "Attention brings heat." Frank met his gaze. "Heat is coming whether I want it or not." The middle man set his glass down untouched. "Here's our concern. Bumpy's death creates a vacuum. Vacuums get filled, sometimes by chaos, sometimes by someone who thinks they're bigger than they are." Frank's voice dropped a fraction. "I'm not trying to be bigger. I'm trying to be smart." The older man leaned back. "Then understand this. Harlem's money doesn't move without somebody taking a cut. That's how New York works. That's how it's always worked." Frank stared at him. "Maybe that's why it's always been one-sided." Silence. Not angry silence. Evaluating silence. Frank could feel the room deciding whether he was bold enough to respect or foolish enough to remove. The middleman finally spoke, calm and clean. "We can do this 2 ways, he said. "One way is ugly. The other way is controlled." Frank nodded once. "I prefer controlled." "Good," the man said. "Then here's the offer. You keep Harlem calm. No headlines, no bodies on sidewalks, no noise. If you can do that for 6 months, you'll have proven something. Frank's eyes hardened. And if I can't? The man's smile appeared, small and cold. Then Harlem becomes a project, and projects get managed. Frank understood that word. Managed meant taken. Frank held the man's gaze and said something Bumpy would have respected. "I'll keep Harlem calm," Frank said, "but I'm not taking orders from people who don't live here." The quiet man's mouth twitched, almost to admiration. The older man stared like he wanted to argue, but the middle man lifted a hand and ended it. "Then we have an understanding," the middle man said. Frank stood. As he turned to leave, the middle man added one last sentence, soft enough to sound like advice. "You're standing on a legend now, Frank. Be careful. Legends attract hunters." Frank didn't look back. Outside, the night air felt sharper than it should. Ava was waiting in the car, eyes searching his face like she was reading tomorrow's newspaper. "What did they want?" she asked. Frank opened the door and sat down slowly. "They wanted to see if I was real," he said. "And?" Eva whispered. Frank stared through the windshield at Harlem's distant lights. "I think they just decided I'm worth killing." Harlem didn't bow to speeches. Harlem bowed to proof. By the next day, the story of the funeral had already grown legs. It was moving through barber shops, corner stores, back rooms, and quiet kitchen tables where old heads still remembered how Harlem used to be before everyone started chasing attention. Some people said Frank put the money right on the casket. Some said he handed it to Bumpy's people and told them, "No one touches this family." Some said he looked the toughest men in the city in the eyes and made them look away first. Frank knew how Harlem worked. It didn't need exact details. It needed a message. And the message was spreading. Frank Lucas didn't show up like a servant. He showed up like a man who understood what respect cost. For the street, that mattered almost more than truth. But Frank wasn't drunk on the myth. He was focused on the danger behind it. Because the same story that made men nod also made men plan. In the days that followed, Frank moved carefully. He showed up to the right places. He spoke to the right people. He didn't brag. He didn't flash. He let the funeral moment do the talking while he did the quiet work, building relationships, securing loyalty, calming nerves. Bumpy had been a stabilizer. Frank had to become a strategist. The first test came fast. A crew from uptown tried to claim a corner that used to stay peaceful under Bumpy's presence. Nothing huge. Just a pressure move, a way to see if the new era had rules. Frank didn't respond with a parade of violence. That would be predictable, and predictable got you targeted. Instead, he responded with something more unsettling. He walked there, no entourage, no shouting, just him and one trusted man behind him, quiet and alert. The corner boys stiffened when they saw him. One of them, too young to have lived through the older Harlem wars, smirked. "You Bumpies." "Ghost now?" the kid asked. Frank stared at him for a long second. Not angry. Measured. "You ever see what happens when a kid confuses a corner for a kingdom?" Frank asked. The kid laughed like he didn't know fear yet. Frank stepped closer, voice calm. "This ain't yours," he said. "It was never yours. It's borrowed space." The kid's smile faded slightly. Frank continued, still calm. "Here's the difference between me and the loud ones. The loud ones make examples. I make math." He leaned in just enough to be heard. "You can leave now and keep breathing," Frank said. "Or you can stay and teach everybody what a bad decision looks like." The kid hesitated. Behind him, older men, men with scars and eyes that didn't jump, were watching Frank differently. They recognized the tone. They recognized the lesson. The kid backed up, trying to save face. "Man, whatever." Frank nodded like he didn't care about pride. "Good," he said. "Go be whatever. Somewhere else." The crew left. No shots, no bodies. But the message traveled faster than bullets. Frank Lucas didn't need chaos to control a room. That's when the bowing started. Not literally on knees. Harlem didn't do that. But in the way men stepped aside. in the way conversations changed when he arrived, in the way ambitious people stopped saying driver and started saying Frank. And then came the most dangerous part of power. The people who wanted it started offering it. A man approached Frank outside a social club, voice respectful. "Everybody's talking," the man said. "They're saying you're the one holding it together." Frank kept his face neutral. "Talking gets people killed." The man nodded. "Then I'll say it quiet. You need protection. Real protection. Because some people don't like the way the wind is blowing." Frank's eyes narrowed. "Who?" The man swallowed. "Men who think Harlem belongs to them. Men who think Bumpy. Dying means everybody who's black and smart should go back to being small." Frank looked away toward the street. He felt it too. The hunters. Frank didn't respond with panic. He responded with a decision. "Tell everybody," Frank said softly. "I'm not making noise. I'm making structure." The man nodded. "And the funeral money?" Frank's jaw tightened a fraction. "That wasn't for a show," he said. "That was a line." The man hesitated. "A line for who?" Frank turned his head slowly, eyes cold now. "For anyone who thinks they can touch what Bumpy built," he said. And that night, while Harlem whispered Frank's name with new respect, a car rolled slowly down Lenox Avenue, lights off, carrying men who weren't whispering at all. They were deciding whether Frank Lucas would live long enough to become real, or whether Bumpy's funeral would be the last time Harlem ever heard his name. Frank came home late, not because he was careless, but because he was listening. Harlem talked in patterns. Footsteps changed when fear moved in. Cars idled longer than they needed to. Men who used to joke stopped joking. It was all language, street language, and Frank had learned to translate it. Eva met him at the door, eyes sharp. "You're being followed," she said. Frank didn't deny it. He took off his coat slowly, like he wasn't giving the fear any satisfaction. "Yeah," he said. "I know." Eva swallowed. "Then why are you walking around like nothing's happening?" Frank looked at her, and for a second his face softened. "Because if I act hunted," he said, "I become hunted." He moved toward the kitchen, poured a glass of water, drank it like he was a normal man with a normal life. That was part of the performance, too. Calm wasn't just a feeling. Calm was a weapon. A knock hit the door. Not a friendly knock, a deliberate knock. Eva froze. Frank set the glass down gently. "Stay back," he said. He walked to the door and opened it. A boy stood there, young, skinny, eyes too serious for his age. The kind of kid who ran messages because adults didn't want their own hands dirty. The kid didn't step in. He held out an envelope. "No name," the kid said. "Just said it's for you. Had to be now." Frank took it without rushing. "Who told you to bring it?" The kid shook his head fast. "I don't know. A man. A man in a nice suit." Then the boy turned and disappeared down the hallway like he wanted to be nowhere near what came next. Frank closed the door and stared at the envelope. Eva's voice was small. "Frank." He didn't answer. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. No letterhead, no signature, just words. Frank read them once, then again. Eva watched his face change, not into fear, but into something colder. "What is it?" she asked. Frank handed it to her. Eva read, lips moving silently. Then her hand flew to her mouth. On the paper, written in clean, neat handwriting, were 7 words. "You can honor Bumpy, but you can't inherit him." Below that was an address, and below the address was a time. Midnight. Eva looked up, eyes wet. "This is a trap." Frank took the paper back, folded it carefully like it was evidence, and slid it into his pocket. "It might be," he said. Eva grabbed his arm. "Then don't go." Frank stared at the wall for a moment, as if he could see Harlem's future through it. "If I don't go," he said quietly, "I told them I'm not real." Eva's voice cracked. "Frank, please." Frank cut her off gently. "Baby, listen to me." He turned to her fully. "What happened at that funeral," he said, "wasn't the end. It was the announcement." Eva shook her head. "Announcement of what?" Frank's eyes hardened. "Of a challenge," he said. "And, in this city, when a challenge is issued, somebody answers." He grabbed his coat again. Eva stepped in front of him. "You think Bumpy would want this?" Frank's jaw flexed. "I think Bumpy understood something," Frank said. "When power shifts, you either stand up or you get stepped on." He moved past her, opened the door, and paused on the threshold. He didn't look back right away. Then he said the line that made Eva's blood go cold. "The only question is, who wrote that note?" He stepped into the hallway, and as the door clicked shut behind him, the camera of the story would linger on the envelope's final detail. One small mark Eva hadn't noticed until it was too late. A faint blue ink stamp. A symbol. Not Harlem, not the streets. Something older. Something organized. Eva whispered into the empty apartment, "Frank, that's not a gangster's mark." And the cliffhanger hit like a gun cocking in the dark. Because Frank Lucas wasn't walking into a Harlem beef anymore. He was walking into something with rules, and the kind of men who enforced them didn't miss.